Hey guys, so today you and I are going to talk about Bootstrap and the Bootstrap grid system. So let's get into it. So the question in question today was, Frederick, I'm struggling with getting my head around how the Bootstrap grid system works. Do you have any tips? Well, I do, because I had this problem as well. This exact, very exact problem. And at least I thought so. But the Bootstrap grid system and how it works and so forth, I thought it was a bit complicated in the beginning of things. And I tried my best to study like the documentation, and although I will personally say that the documentation for Bootstrap is absolutely amazing, just in general, like I think it's very accessible and very well made, the grid system is a bit of a problem because I will argue it assumes two things about the reader, at least the last time I checked the documentation. Now I'm going to admit that it was a while since I checked the documentation. But there are two things that are assumed, and these are the things that I think that you should have a look at, and these are the things that at least help me to understand it. So the first assumption is that you know what a grid actually is and its purpose in the context of design. What do I mean by that? Well, I basically mean that if I tell you that, all right, the layout that we're working on is an 8-column layout, do you know what that means? If I say, okay, these grid gaps or these lines aren't aligned, do you know what I'm talking about? Now, when I first started, I had no idea what that meant. Like, I understood what a grid kind of was, but I didn't really understand what it meant to use a grid in the context of a design. So what I actually did was pretty much the tip that I'm going to give you. So I had a look at web design, or not necessarily just web design, but designs just in general. I focused on web design, of course, because this is very associated to the thing we're doing, right? And I just went and had a look at different videos on YouTube and different articles and so forth where people introduce their own workflow, where they just explain how they work with a grid, so to speak. And that's pretty much it. That's it. After watching a few videos, because I will tell you this, designers who make content usually have they're pretty good at making very accessible content. Go figure, right? And from that, I understood what it meant to work with the grid. I understood what the layouts, like what this jargon was about, and kind of the mindset behind using grids within your layout systems, and so forth and so forth and so forth. And it was actually through that it started clicking for me how a grid actually is supposed to work in the context of a web page design or something like that. And when I kind of had that mental picture, and not just the mental picture, but also the value, like I understood the reason why we're doing things in this manner, I started to understand the purpose of Bootstrap pretty much. Like I'm not saying that I didn't understand it to begin with, but it became very easy for me to understand why this row and column layout system that they have is so clever, and why it fits so well quite a lot of people's workflow. So that's the first thing. I would just tell you that. The second thing that I felt that made it much easier for me to understand the Bootstrap grid system was that I needed to understand responsive design, like really understand responsive design. Because when you're working with the Bootstrap, well, with the grid system, you're basically laying out different column sizes, as you probably remember, or as you know, you have a row and then you have your different columns, and then you say if it's small, it's medium, it's large, extra small, etc., etc., etc. Now, these are just indicators where the number that you actually give is just the how many columns is that element going to take up. So let's say that you have a row div, and let's say that you have two boxes next to each other, and then you say something like 6.6 or something of that nature. Well, or MD66, which would say that which would mean that on a medium-sized screen you're going to have two columns, or you're going to have, no, you're not going to have 2 columns, but you're going to have 2 elements that span a total of 12 columns, and each of those boxes are going to contain, or like in these, this is why this is so important for you to really understand this imaginary grid that a lot of designers work with. Because if you can imagine that for yourself, you will know that these 2 boxes will take up 12 columns, imaginary columns, and each of them will be 6 columns in width on a medium screen. And then the other measurements comes in, where you might say that, okay, I don't want them to lie side by side on a small screen. I just want the small screen to be one single column. Then you can say something like XS, like extra small, and say 12 as an example. And if you say that on both of these, basically what the effect that you will get is that, all right, then each of these boxes will take up 12, like the full width of columns all across the board, and that means that they can't both fit on the same line, so they will start going, they will flow underneath each other. So if you're paying attention here, that's the part that you need to get, the responsiveness, because something that was at least tricky for me to understand in the beginning was partly the grid, like what does that actually mean to have a grid and work with it, and the second part was, of course, as I was saying, like how does these things flow on a screen, because I couldn't really get, okay, so you're going to have 12 columns on a mobile and on a desktop, how does that fit in together? Well, it's actually very simple, because these columns are just sections of the total space available. It's still 12 columns, it's just that you have smaller columns on a smaller screen and bigger columns on a bigger screen. And it becomes pretty much, it's not tied into the screen width. And I really urge you to go and have a look at a few design videos to get this concept. So what I want you to take away from this is that, at least for me, when it came to understanding the Bootstrap grid system, the thing that helped the most was to actually go and look at how designers work with the layout or a web page or something like that while they're actually using the grid system, and just see how they lay things out. And then you start to see that these overlapping lines, these imaginary lines, they actually fit very nicely together with different elements on the page, and how that affects the layout of the page. The second thing is that you really need to understand how responsive design actually works, where, all right, you have your 12 column layout, but if you restructure your page or your screen width shrinks, well, the total amount of space is also shrinking, so you might have to reshuffle the positions of the elements. An example is, if you have a really wide screen, you might have 2 elements next to each other that take up the full 12 columns. But when you're on a mobile device, maybe those 2 elements are too big to actually naturally fit on the same line, so you might have to put them underneath each other. And the way that Bootstrap expresses this is through the size, like the small XS, SM, like the size measurements that is included in the grid classes, and with the number that represents how many columns they should take of the total space available. Have a great day.